Folks, we are learning this week on our journey through Nach, through Yehoshua, perek Tes Zayin and Yud Zayin, 16 and 17. Why two prakim? The reason is because although last week we learned 15, which was the longest chapter in Yehoshua, today the first perek we learn is the shortest chapter. It's only 10 psukim long, and it's really very much connected to the next chapter, which is 17. So we can look at the two together, which is not so long itself. It's only 18 psukim. And the general topic over here is now the allotment of not Yehuda, but the allotment of Yosef. You'll always notice that the two primary figures in all of Jewish leadership is going to be Yehuda and Yosef. And in fact, the two kingdoms that we're going to see, the split follows afterwards, is going to be primarily Yosef and Yehuda. In fact, where the Mishkan belongs is going to be in Shiloh, which is in Har Ephraim. Right, so Shiloh is around here-ish. Right, so Shiloh is in the center, is the capital of Ephraim. Right, and then it's going to, that's for 369 years, that's where the center of religious life is. Then it's going to move to Jerusalem a little further south, which is in the center of Judea. Right, we know that the northern kingdom is always going to be called Ephraim, which is sort of the name for the northern kingdom. So it's no surprise to us now in history. It may have been a surprise then, but it was no surprise to us seeing all of this, that Yosef's going to be next in the division. And if you want to sort of plot it, we've already talked about East Bank. Now we're going to talk about West Bank, which is really Israel Central, and we're moving upwards, right? So it makes sense that we start at the south. The southernmost regions is Beersheba and Kadesh, and we're going to move all the way upwards as we go to the northern tribes. So our next step, of course, is to move here. We are skipping out Binyamin, who's kind of over here. So just to understand that Binyamin is a little bit eclipsed. Now we're going to move to Ephraim, which is in this section. I don't have a chance to Menashe, which is in this section. Menashe, of course, is going to be adjacent to his easterly half tribe, so there's a land bridge between the two of them. That's what we're dealing with. In our first chapter, we hear about the gvulos, the boundaries. I'm not going to go through each one of them right now, but you can see how it's described. So let's just give an example. In the first verse of Gvul Livnei Yosef Miyarden Yericho, so it goes from the Jordan and Jericho. That's where it starts. Lemei Mericha Mizracha Hamidbar, or Lem Yericha Bahar Beis El. So it goes up in the desert to Beit El, right? So we know where Beit El is. Beit El is just north of Yerushalayim. So it's sort of going up as a diagonal up the mountain. And we know when we drive from Yerushalayim to Jericho to the Dead Sea, you see the transition of landscape, right? You're transitioning from mountain landscape to desert landscape. So that's what it means, that you're going from, this is the opposite direction, from Jericho to Beit El, up in the Midbar, right? And it goes on to describe each of these journeys as it moves away to the coast and then moves its way backwards. What is interesting is that in this description of the boundaries, it puts the Bnei Yosef, the children of Joseph, together. And then in the beginning of the next perek is where it describes the portions of Menashe versus Ephraim. Because remember that Bnei Yosef really is two sections. And so the southern part of Yosef is going to be Ephraim, which is called Har Ephraim, is sort of the area which stretches from north of Jerusalem up to the Shechem area. That's called the Har Ephraim area, which is where the Mishkan lives. And then we move upwards into the sort of the southern Galilee, which is where some of Menashe is as well. And we're not going to go through all of these, all the psukim specifically now, not to trace every part of this, but it is interesting just to point out a few details along the way. So we hear about the 10 families of Menashe. So these are called Batei Avot, the houses of the fathers that are divided. It seems that 4 are on the east bank and 6 on the west bank of the Jordan. And then we have this very interesting interlude in Pasuk Gimel, on the top of page 2. But it's Tzlafchad ben Chefer ben Gilad ben Machir ben Menashe lo hayu lo banim ki im badnos. We meet Tzlafchad again. Now Tzlafchad happens to no longer be, right? He is no longer in the picture for whatever reason, as was given in the Torah. They reappear. Remember that everything it talks about in the Torah about what shall happen, we have to see if it actually shall happen, right? So this is where it's happening. It says, "Vatikravna lifnei Elazar HaKohen v'lifnei Yehoshua ben Nun v'lifnei Anisim lemor tzivom es Moshe Hashem tzivo es Moshe l'oses lanu nachla b'soich acheinu v'yitanu al pi Hashem nachla b'soich achei avihen." They make the demand as was promised to them in Parshas Pinchas, that they should get the land, and so it is. They get the land. That's what's given to them as well. Okay, good. And we hear about the 10 families. We hear about 6 on one side and 4 on the other side. But here we meet the first time a little bit of failure. If you look in the next section, which is called the limits of success, pasuk Yud Beis, v'lo yachlu b'nei Menashe lo rishas ha'arim ha'ele they were not able to conquer all of these villages. Vayoel HaKnani lo sheves ba'aretz hazos, and the Canaanites resolved or strong to dwell in this land. Vayihi kichazku b'nei Yisrael v'yitnu es HaKnani lo mas v'areish lo yarishu. So what happens? Instead of conquering them, what do?
Slavery.
They subjugate them, right? So they say, listen, you're going to be members, you're going to be sub-citizens or citizens of our society, and you'll pay taxes to us. Which is fascinating because this is precisely what the Torah says not to do, right? So the Torah, now remember, if they decide to be a ger toshav and they renounce their pagan faith and they are monotheistic and they live, then that's fine. But it doesn't sound like that renunciation was made here. It sounds just like it was a little bit too much of a bother to go. War leads on and people on reserve duty, and it's hard on the families, and the war's been too long, Mr. Prime Minister. Let's just stop now, right? So that's what sounds like happened over here. And because of this, there's going to be problems, right? There's going to be later on religious problems because, yes, it may be true that they're paying taxes, but their kids still go to the same public schools. And then barbecues on Sundays, right? Right. So like then the girls and the boys and they're fraternizing around the pool, and then he comes home with her and she comes home with him, and like it becomes complicated, right? So the Torah understands sociology over here and says this shouldn't happen, but nonetheless is our first opportunity that where they didn't take advantage of it in the northern regions, and this is going to lead to problems. It's going to lead to assimilation. It's going to lead to enculturation and all the problems that we are going to encounter later on in Shoftim. Okay, and finally, then we have the last section is a really fascinating conversation. We now have a complaint on the docket, right? So here we go. Ready for this? We think that God, Goral, Urim v'Tumim. You can't get much better than that, right? I mean, this is as good as it gets. But not these, not everybody's happy in the shul,
With the Jewish.
Yeah, right. The air conditioning is a little too cold for some folks. So here we go. So so they say, "Vayedabru b'nei Yosef el Yehoshua lemor." The children of Joseph come in front of Yehoshua and say, "Madzu nasat li Nach lagora lechad v'chever lechad v'ani amra v'asher kol berchani Hashem." We are a very big nation. You gave us one plot, one area of land. Vayomer lahem Yehoshua im amra v'ata. Hey, listen, if you don't like the land that you got, then go clear the forest, right? There's a lot of Canaanites down there, right? Do your job, right? Do your job. Get rid of them, clear the forest, like take it down and take the land. So they come back to him and they report, they say, no, that's not so easy. We can't. There's not enough space on the mountains because if you've flown over, if you've seen the area of Har Ephraim, it's all mountainous. That's right. You're going through the valleys, so there's not enough space in the mountain areas. But if you go down to the valley area, the Canaanites have rechav barzel, iron chariots. Right. So remember, at this point in time, Israel's infantry don't do so well with infantry against chariots. Right. So it's a problem. So this is the area they're referring to, the Jezreel Valley, right, and Beit Shan over here. So they say that area we can't dominate because the chariots are going to dominate it as well, right? They've got tanks, right? We've got APCs, right? That's kind of like what they're saying. So so they Vayomer Yehoshua beis Yisrael Ephraim Rivnashe Lemor Am Ravata L'Koach Gadol L'Chol Lo Yeh L'Cha Gora L'Echad. You know what? You're a strong nation. There's a lot of you. You shouldn't have just one portion. Kihar yelachalach kiyaru uveraso vayelachat tzadsav kisaresh sakani kirecha badzeloi kichazaku. You should go and clear the forest because they have, or despite the fact that they have chariots. Not very clear what Yehoshua is answering them because he just sounds like he's repeating them, which is a good listening technique. But the question is what does it actually mean? Like, what is he actually saying to them? So let's quickly take a look at the maps for a moment, just to appreciate on the next page, on page 3, just what is going on here. You'll notice that Ephraim is that section which is just about Benjamin. This is the Israel Central. If anybody's spent time going to Shiloh, if anybody's spent time going to the area of Shechem, right? This all the Yishuvim around there, Elon Moreh, Har Bracha, right? This area, that's all Har Ephraim. This particular area, very beautiful area. And then you go further north. As we move into the lower Galilee is Menashe. It's you can see different sort of versions of it. The main point is it's supposed to be that Menashe is connected to his east bank contingent as well, and it seems rather large, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, the remaining just for this tribe. Let's get into some of the details here. One of the details in this perek, which I think that most people miss when they learn this, is authorship, which is such an important question. You see, we have a phrase in this perek which appears so many times in Yehoshua, which is Ad Hayom Hazeh, which is until this very day, which is actually appears at the end of perek Tes Zayin 16, and it describes that the Canaanites remained in the land Ad Hayom Hazeh, until this day. It's the very last pasuk. And this phrase, in fact, appears many times. We've passed it a few times, but I didn't call attention to it up till now, but I think it's important to appreciate this. Ad Hayom Hazeh appears when they put the rocks in the Jordan. They said the stones remained until today. And describes about the Bris Milah, the area they did it, Ad Hayom Hazeh. It talks about the Jebusites last week, who stayed in Jerusalem, Ad Hayom Hazeh. Ad Hayom Hazeh is a really fascinating phrase, because it indicates, right, in a certain sense, that the author is saying what happened then is true now. Right? The author is saying, folks, go out and look and you'll see those stones. Folks, go out and you'll see the Jebusites are still in Jerusalem. You'll see the Canaanites are still in the area of Har Ephraim. Ad Hayom Hazeh. So who wrote the book of Yehoshua? So we actually have a Gemara in Bava Basra which talks about the authorship. Chazal actually talk about authorship of these little books. And the authorship describes that Moshe Kosav Sifra Parshas Bilam ve'Iyov. So we know that Moshe Rabbeinu is the author of Sifra, his book, meaning the 5 books of Moses. That's why it's called the 5 books of Moses. And he also wrote Sefer Bilam, right, which is why, by the way, Parshas Bilam, which makes sense because that was a section which he was not present for, right? Meaning Moshe Rabbeinu was not party to Parshas Bilam. I don't think that was happening on an adjacent mountaintop, right? So the point is that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote about it prophetically, even though he wasn't present for the experience. And the Eov and the book of Job, well, that's not for now. And then it says Yehoshua Kosav Sifra Shmona Psukim B'Shavat Torah. Yehoshua wrote his book, and the last 8 psukim in the Torah. Why the last 8 psukim? Because Moshe Rabbeinu died, so that was the 8th last pasuk in the Torah. So Yehoshua wrote it from there onwards. Okay, debate not for our discussion right now, but the assumption of the Gemara is that Yehoshua wrote his book. Therefore, says the Radak, yes, at the end of his life, he wrote Ad Hayom Hazeh until this day. That's what happened. The problem is as Barbanel points out in his introduction to Sefer Yehoshua, is that's not an awfully long amount of time, right? Because we know that we're already told that Yehoshua is old. They've stopped the wars. There's 7 years of conquest, of distribution of the land. But it doesn't sound like the kind of writing or the kind of phrase you would write after just a few years when everybody who is your contemporary is still alive, right? Meaning, Ad Hayom Hazeh is the kind of thing you say to your grandkids, right? You know, if you go and the border of Lawrence, you'll see this old house that, when my grandparents came to this neighborhood, that's what you say when you're trying to tell them something they don't know. But like Yehoshua is the oldest of the generation. Remember, he was a spy 40 years ago. 54 years ago. He was back in the desert. So he is at the tail end of the generation, right? So yes, they've just made a conquest, but everybody's around to see that. It doesn't make sense, which leads to Abarbanel. This is just, by the way, this is just such an Abarbanel moment to appreciate this as he writes this. By the way, Abarbanel is writing on the run, just so you should appreciate this. In 1492, in the 3-month period that the Jews have been given to evacuate all 200,000 plus Jews to leave all of Spain, right? And then we're talking about fire sales in the property, nothing left behind. I mean, terrible, cataclysmic event for Jewry. The Abarbanel is the second most powerful Jew in Spain, and he is negotiating with Ferdinand and Isabella at this point in time, and to no avail. Right? There's financial interest, of course. There's religious interest, motivation, because they now cleanse the Muslims from the southern ends of the Iberian Peninsula. They need to use the Jewish assets to finance the end of that war. Just understand the mechanics. It always comes back to money, right? So they need the money of the property that's going to be left behind. There's also this religious, dogma which is pushing them, specifically Isabella, and they're not. He doesn't win this argument. He therefore now, as opposed to renouncing his faith, which is what is done by Don Isaac Senor, he's the most powerful Jew in Spain, renounces his faith to become Christian to retain his assets. Now Abarbanel leaves all his assets behind, keeps his faith, and moves to Vienna. And he has a number of journeys. In that journey is when he wrote his Pirush on Yosef Yehoshua. So just to appreciate, let's lean in and appreciate that his observation that he's writing over here is a Jew in exile, leaving behind everything. Okay? So this is when he wrote it. I wish in our most harried times in life, we would have anything to produce like the Abarbanel's Pirush on Yehoshua. This is what he says in his introduction to it. He says, I put it in source 6, but we're not going to read the whole thing. I just want to read one line in the end of the first paragraph. It's 5 lines from the bottom, where it says, V'im Yehoshua kosav kol zeh. He gives an example. So it's on page 4, the 4 lines to the bottom of the middle of the first paragraph. Eich yomar bohem Ad Hayom Hazeh. What he's describing is very close to the episodes that actually happened. It sounds like it should have happened much later. And therefore, in the second paragraph, I skipped a middle in the middle. Yehoshua is not the author of the book of Yehoshua. Aval Shmuel Hanavi Kosav v'gam kein Sefer Shoftim v'lozeh lo timotzei shenamar b'Yehoshua shekosai. So, meaning the book never says that Yehoshua wrote it. He thinks that Shmuel wrote it, which is already now 3.5 centuries later, which makes sense that Shmuel is saying Ariyamazeh, meaning, folks, you go out and you look and you see that pile of stones. That's what happened in the times of Joshua, right? That's the way that Abarbanel says it. And he says, but you're going to tell me I'm going against Chazal, right? That's pretty significant. So the Abarbanel says already in Chazal you see this dispute as to authorship as to different places. And he says if they open it, I'm going to have to open that question further, which is remarkable. You can imagine that he gets himself in trouble in some camps for this, because some people don't appreciate being able. They will say that what Chazal say is immutable. There's no way to move around that. We're going to have to figure out the discrepancies. And the Malbim is very much against Abarbanel on these things, but it is important to appreciate Abarbanel is willing to do this, and this goes into a very interesting discussion: is can you disagree with Chazal? And the answer is in halacha, no. Right? What about Agada? What about when it comes to philosophy? Right, where it doesn't affect normative action. So who wrote the book of Yehoshua does not change whether I put on tefillin or I daven shachris, right? So in that case, there happens to be a little bit of a dispute. The Abarbanel is very firmly in the camp that if it's not something relating to halacha, there is the option of analyzing things and texts and saying, we have a different perspective over here when it comes to this. The way that Ibn Ezra, who also belongs to this camp, would say it is, im kabbalah hi nakabel. If it is a tradition that this is such, then I'm not going to argue the tradition. But if it was a derivation, not a tradition, that Chazal thought, well, I think that there are other indicators to it being different. We're entering into the realm of a very different way of looking at Tanakh, and this is what Abarbanel does it based on this phrase. If you are interested, if this is something which interests you for further thought, there is a book, Rabbi Amnon Razak, which has been translated into English, called Until This Very Day. Ad hayom hazeh. Right? So this phrase is a really important phrase because it relates to authorship. He's not just talking about authorship. He's talking about archaeological finds and contradictions and contradictions between books and how to put it all together. It's a remarkable work of art. If this does not bother you, don't go into it. Right? No, just like it always bothers me that people will say, like, how could they say those things? So I was like, if it's not a problem for you, then don't ask the question. But if these are the things that bother you, understand that very great people have written about it and it's been talked about. So this belongs in the category of authorship, and this relates to this particular event. It could be that Abarbanel acknowledges at the end that it could be a little bit of a blend, which is maybe Yehoshua wrote his book, but maybe Sefer Shmuel edited it, which means we're not saying it's a non-profit. It was still a fully for-profit organization, right? And Shmuel added in the phrases to help, like these phrases, Ad hayom hazeh, to help us, the reader, at his time, understand these prophetically, which is helpful. Just understand what's going on over here, but it's something that can't really be ignored, even though it sometimes is a little bit of an inconvenient phrase. Yeah.
So who do you think wrote it?
You're saying which camp am I in?
Which camp are you?
So I'm in the in-between camp. I mean, you're putting me on the spot over here. I'm in the in-between camp. It seems very clear. From many Mefarshim, Radak and Rashi included at times, that they will disagree with Chazal when it comes to Milei Agada, when it comes to philosophical matters, not halachic matters. The reason why I'm not fully in that camp is I don't believe, therefore, that today any person who's spent 2 years learning Torah has an opinion on the same level, which means what the Abarbanel is doing we can't do as easily. So for him to say, look, Chazal are deliberating, so I'm going to offer my opinion, is not the same as a 21st century millennial who's watched a few videos on Near Eastern archaeology to say, well, seeing as the Abarbanel said this, I say this. Do you understand? So I just feel the extrapolation is a dangerous one because people feel enfranchised sometimes, but they don't even know the book, if you know what I'm saying. So if you know the book, then there's what to say. Also, the other thing is that Abarbanel is firmly working within the principles of the basic axioms for faith. He doesn't agree with the Rambam's axioms of faith. He has a more expansive view of he wrote a book called Rosh Amanah on the Rambam's principles of faith. He has a much more expansive version, but he's working within the framework of that. So today, sometimes you'll see people who make observations which are actually heretical in the name of expanded view. So it's a complicated. This is why this is you're walking on very thin ice as you go into this area, as you sort of leave the realm of the tent, so to speak, of Chazal. But it is important to appreciate that it's not completely out of the tent. There are real people who think this way, and I believe that he's right on the truth. I absolutely believe he's on the truth. At the same time, is just the next step is sometimes a little bit of an educational slippery slope, which is why sometimes people veer away from it, not because of the lack of truth, but because of the lack of the educational impact of going into this topic. I just think it's a really important question to be asked. Having been exposed to much more concerning observations, I can testify to this. But let's go a little further. So there's something which doesn't bother you, don't go there. If it is something as a curious, interested human being, that is, understand that this is talked about, and specifically in places like Machon Herzog in Har Etzion, places that are very serious Bible scholars who are of our tradition. Okay, be it as it may.
The Chazal view is that he wrote it in Ruach HaKodesh. He's writing.
Yes. Well, there's no question that. Yeah. Okay, you're right. It is a strange phrase, meaning he's projecting what you're going to see in the future is Arayam Hazeh. That would be the way to.
Doesn't it say the same thing?
What was?
You have it in a few places in the Torah.
That's where it becomes more complicated. You see, the I want you to understand the book until this very day is about the Torah Ad Hayom Hazeh, not about the Tanakh ones are easy. This is easy. We get into much more complicated questions on the Ad Hayom Hazeh and the Torah because who's writing that? V'aknani az ba'aretz. The Canaanites were then in the land. Who's writing that in Parshas Lech Lecha? Now you get now that's a 800-pound question. That's not a small question because to say that Shmuel added on to Yehoshua, no, that's water off the duck's back, right? To say somebody else added on Psukim to the Torah, that you've crossed the red line. So you understand. So it becomes more complicated, and that's the discussion in the framework of this reference. So just understand this is the complexity of this topic. But nonetheless, let's appreciate this. Okay, so now let's go a little further. For now, let's go back to the Tabbanas Tzlafchad for a second. They make this request. We see it in Parshas Pinchas. We know they made this request. It's a girls-only family, which is a wonderful thing. Progressively, the Torah has not yet incorporated girls into the inheritance. Because they ask about it, they are enfranchised, they're part of the Nachla. The Gemara tells us a beautiful thing. It's called Megalgalin Zchus al Yedei Zakai. God wanted to teach this, meaning this was the Torah's intention, but because he knew, Hashem knew, that there were going to be these young ladies who so desired to be part of the land of Israel, Hashem allowed them to facilitate the question being the trigger for the Torah, the teaching which were to have been taught otherwise. Just a beautiful description, and that is in Parshas Pinchas. Meaning you want to be the vehicle you want to be the one to initiate this. The question becomes is what exactly is happening, and I want to just make this just a little more complicated for people to appreciate what's going on over here. And that is as follows. Take a look on page 5 at the very bottom. This is the Gemara in Bava Basra Yud Zayin Amud Aleph on Shama Beis. And the Gemara is just trying to figure out what happened with the daughters of Tzlafchad, because the Mishnah describes they claimed 3 portions. What does it mean they claimed 3 portions? So the Gemara gives us 3 possibilities of how the land was bequeathed. And this is where I just wanted to appreciate this is not just like a one-to-one easy conversation. So here are the 3 opinions. Opinion number 1. Titania, Rabbi Yehoshua would say, the people who left the land of Egypt were the ones who dictated the numbers by which the land was divided. Because that's the pasuk says according to the names of their fathers they will inherit. But that the pasuk in Parshas Pinchas also says to these, implying the people of the next generation are the ones who divide their inheritance. So it's excluding those who are the children, but really it's the adults, which means this opinion understands that if you have X amount of people that left Egypt, that X amount of people dictated how many portions they would be given. It's the next generation. So the next generation would either benefit or lose because of that. So as an example, let's say you have let's say 2 brothers who leave Egypt, and one of them has a single child and one of them has 9 children. So then what's going to happen is the one who has 9 children, the same property. They'll both get equal properties. And the one who has 9 children had to subdivide that property into 9 sections. By the way, there's a lot of land, so we're not talking about, we're not talking about tenement apartments here. But there's going to be it'll be subdivided that way, which means that's what's called the Yotzei Mitzrayim, right? That's model number 1, because there's a stira in the psukim. What was that?
At certain age.
Meaning all people within the age of 20 to 60 within that range were called army age would be the ones to receive, and then their children now come in with birth or death certificate of their parents, show them a specific age. They come to the office of zoning or distribution, and they say, okay, this is what you're going to get based on. So it's not depending on how many you are, it's depending on how many your parents were. That's the first model of understanding this. However, the second model is Rabbi Yochanan Omer on page 6. Leboya Aretz Nischal Haaretz. No, it is actually based on the numbers of those who came to the land. Shenemar La'ele Techalek Haaretz Benachla. To these you'll divide the land in inheritance, because remember there's a contradiction between the psukim. What does it mean that according to the names of the tribes of the parents? It says Mishoneh Nachla Zemikol Nachla Shavolim. This is a very unusual Nachla. Shekol Nachla Shavolim Chayin Yorshin Meisin Chan Meisin Yorshin Chayin. The dead inherit the land. What does that mean? It's a little complicated, but the way it works like this. Let's go back to our model. Like we have Reuven and Shimon, right? Reuven and Shimon come to the land, are generation 1, right? They have, Reuven has 1 son, Shimon has 9 sons, right? So what happens is they get 10 portions, right? Because there's 10 people coming to the land. It's 9 and 1 of the next generation, right? What happens is those generations are kicked back to generation 1 and are redistributed among the family they came from, which means the 2 brothers, right? Reuven and Shimon, which means now it goes 5-5. Right now the 5 go down to the 9 and 5 go down to the 1, right? Which is meaning the Chayim, so the Mesim are Yoshim HaChayim, the dead, the first generation, are inheriting the numbers of. So it's a very fascinating model. It's trying to bridge these 2 psukim. Is it the people who come in or the people who are left? Is it those who are part of the Exodus or part of the Boya Oretz? This is the model number 2. And the third model is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says la'elu v'la'elu. It's both, right? We incorporate the amount of people who are still around and the people who are still here, and it's based on who comes to the desk right now. Really, really fascinating model. If you want to see a little more, I did put a chart in on page 8 at the very bottom, just in case you're interested in. This is a complicated stuff, just about trying to understand the differences of the models of inheriting. Be it as it may. Okay, no, that's for further reference, just to understand this. If you're going through the daf and you're going through Basra Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph to Beis, you want to understand what's going on. These are the 3 models. Which one of them is the model that we adopt? So if you turn to page 9, the Radak points out in source 12, in the second paragraph, this is just to appreciate what the claim is of the daughters of Tzlofchad. So, Aval bi sheyesh b'nei machloikes b'davar, even though there is a 3-way dispute, which you saw in the Gemara, as to what the model of what is the role of generation 1 versus generation 2 in inheritance. Haroiv hishvu bazeh. The Muslim agree that what Kiliotzei Mitzrayim niskal ka'aretz, that it was based on, which is the first opinion, that it was based on those who left Egypt, which dictated the number of property, we'll call units of property that were going to be distributed to the next generation. Therefore, so their initial complaint was that our father's inheritance is going nowhere, right? Because it's now void. So they were saying we want that piece, right? But there's more. But Tzlofchad's dad also, his name was Chefer, came out at the same time. But he died, but Chefer and Tzlofchad now actually have portions. So they're looking for not their father's, but their grandfather's but Tzlofchad also left as a Bechor, as a firstborn, which means out of the number of units of property, there's already 3 units. His father and 2 of his, because he was the firstborn of his brothers. And his brother also died, which means there was a 4th part that he really should have inherited. So there's 4 units of property based on the fact that those 4 people left Egypt, or 3 people in a double portion left Egypt, and now we demand the request of Just understand, it is not just like, we are missing inheritance. There's a number of different units of property based on those who left Egypt, including our father, grandfather, and uncle, who really are, we have a responsibility to. Just understand the complexity of this request based on the models the Gemara puts out to us. Why is the Gemara presenting different models? Because it seems that there's a contradiction in the Psukim as to whether it is the generation 1 and generation 2 and how the 2 work together. And to titrate that, we have this model of those in the second generation inheriting the limits of the first generation. Good. Let's move to the next stage. So now we have the question is, so that's the Bnei Tzlofchad. What about the Bnei Yosef? Why are the Bnei Yosef the only group that lodge a complaint to the zoning department as to their distribution of their inheritance? Why is this them specifically? So the reason is now if we go back to our models, let's go. If we say that it's Liyotzei Mitzrayim, that was generation 1. Now this makes a lot of sense. Take a look at Rashi in source 13. Rashi on page 9, source 13 says, B'sever b'midbar, shneim v'shloshim elef u'mosayim. If you read Parshas Bamidbar, which is the beginning of the desert experience, we have a census. In that census, Menashe has 32,200 males of military age. But fast forward 39 years to the census done at the end of the desert experience, which is in Parshas Pinchas. Okay, because remember, Bamidbar frames 40 years. There's a census at the beginning and a census at the end, so it's very helpful to compare those numbers. Rashi points out the census at the end, 39 years later, Pinchas, Shnayim v'chamishim elef u'shvame'os, 52,700. There's been an explosion of a growth rate in those 39 years, which means they're stuck. They say, wait a moment, if there was only 32,200 at the time we left Egypt, that is X amount of units, right, of property. But we have so many more children, meaning the growth rate, not the numbers, the growth rate has far exceeded any other growth rate, which means now we're limited to a smaller area, which we now have to subdivide. It's not enough space for us all. That's why their complaint is being registered as such. So then the question becomes, so what does Yehoshua do about this valid complaint? This is why they're complaining more than anybody else. So it's not so clear. The Malbim, as an example, says, in source 14, it's a really important observation. He says, Yehoshua, Azra or Yehoshua saw, Ki muchrach lo yisif al gevul arzam. He needed to expand their territory. V'heim he'orim asher mi Yisachar, sh'yosif lo Menashe es beis Shan, and in fact he gives the areas of Yisachar to Yosef because they have a valid claim. Which means when he says you're a great nation at the end of the perek, what he's saying is, I'm acknowledging your claim is correct. I thought it's fascinating because, by the way, if you take a look at this map here for a second, and just flip the page to page 90 degrees, look at the page here where this is actually, by the way, I love this. This map was produced by the IDF mapping unit called the 12 Tribes of Israel. It's just wonderful that the Army of Israel is investing funds for cartographers to map out ancient Israel. I just love that. It's on the Israeli government website. You'll see the Menashe Ephraim is in turquoise, and above it to the right is Yisachar in red. Do you see that? Beit Shan is just below it. Now, I believe that the Malbim's way of reading this is actually exceptionally helpful because it explains why Menashe is so big. Right? Look compared to all the other tribes. Right? Mm-hmm. It's really, really large, considering they also have the East Bank as well. Right? So it sounds like what the Malbim is saying is what accounts for this large expansion is because Yehoshua acknowledged their claim and gave them more land to reflect their population growth. I think that the Malbim makes sense when you look at the map. Now, by the way, these maps are not 100% accurate in the sense that it doesn't bubble out in the Venn diagram the areas they didn't conquer. There's pockets of the lands, especially the Jezreel Valley in the center of Menashe, which they do not have access to. Why? Because of military QME, qualitative military edge. Who has the chariots is the Canaanites. So that area in the center is not there. So it's not really a fully accurate picture. But I do believe that because it includes the area of Beit Shan, I think that the Malbim makes a lot of sense in this respect that they got a little extra property. Yeah.
And does have they even complained that part of it?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So this actually is talked about in the Gemara. The Gemara itself, if we just reverse a couple pages, go to exactly your point. They could look on page 7, the Gemara which I left midway. The Gemara on page 7, in really the middle of the page, there's a paragraph break where it says Amar Abaye. Abaye, one of the later Amoraim, so he's living 1300 years ago, about in the 300s. So Amar Abaye, Shmamina, Loi Havachad Deloi Shakil. There was no tribe it didn't take. The Isal Kadaita Havachad Deloi Shakil. One tribe had not got Ibaile Lemitzvach. They should have complained. They should have cried out. Maybe you're going to say, well, only the ones who cried out and got answers were recorded forever in Tanakh, and those who didn't not. Those of Yosef were called out and they didn't fully get their request. The Gemara says. They didn't fully get their request, which means that this is slightly different from the way the Malbim views it. The Malbim over here, just by the way, is a divergence of one opinion in Chazal in the Malbim, right? Just as another example of this. So the Malbim is saying, no, Yehoshua gave them further area in the north under the tribe of where Yisachar, which was a more diminished area. The Gemara seems to say is demitzvach v'lo yahani, which means they called out, they lodged their complaint, and it didn't work. What does it mean it didn't work? That means to say is that Yehoshua said to them, if you read the last pasuk that he says to them, you're a great nation, and he's not saying you're a great nation, therefore I'm giving you more. You're a great nation, therefore fight. I mean, I gave you the land. Fight for it, conquer it, deforest the area, and you have land. Meaning, do your job. Right? It's always, I find it very fascinating, is sometimes I'll ask shilas about very particular situations, and people view things in a very binary way. Rabbi, it's either this or that. And usually it's not that case. Usually there's like a few middle options, right? Meaning say it's like, it's not that it's a machlokes. What I mean to say is it's a decision they've made. It's like, Rabbi, I booked a flight on Hanukkah at candle lighting time. Right? What should I do? So, well, the first option is to ask before you book the flight. But like, let's say you booked the flight already. Well, depends where you're going to stay that night. Well, I'm in a hotel. Can you find somebody local you can stay by? Like, meaning there are middle ground options between the black and the white, right? So they're saying to Yehoshua, listen, we don't have space. It's not possible. It's the mountains. The mountains can only take so many yeshuvim. So Yehoshua says, well, the forest says, well, they've got military prowess. He says, well, you're a great nation, right? There's a lot of you, so do what you need to. Meaning the point is he's saying is it's not, don't take anybody else's area at the cost of the fact that you're not doing your job. That seems to be what Yehoshua is doing, which is why he's repeating their words as well. Now, just to deepen the words that he actually happens to be saying, the Gemara actually gives us a little bit of a nuance into this as well, which is as follows. The bottom of page 7 we were just reading. Hasom, by the end of our perek, Eitza Tova Kamashmalan. He was giving them a great piece of advice. What is that advice? A person needs to be very careful about the ayin hara, about people looking at you because you're too showy. There's too much, meaning you're a big nation. Don't make it a show that you're so successful, that you had the biggest growth rate in the desert. That's not something, it's wonderful, but don't display it, right? Behind it's a ka'amala Yehoshua. So which is why he says to them, go to the forest. Which meaning his suggestion about going to the forest is populate in a more modest way. Right? Populate in an area which is less showy as to your numbers. And then they say, what is their response? Go to the forest. They responded, go in a place that you're not going to be beholden by the evil eye. People are not going to ask questions about why you did so well. Right? Unfortunately, it's not right that people should do that. We shouldn't be looking at people's properties or success, but the problem is that people are people, right? So therefore we have to do our job to kind of avoid allowing other people to ask their questions. It's always such a balance, right? I mean, I always wonder this about Israel as well. Israel, this technology that can read everything on your phone, they can do drone technology, and everybody's looking and saying, "Oh, those terrible Jews." It's like meaning, on the one hand, we should do good jobs, but a lot of the good jobs we should do is without having to tell everybody about it, right? It's like they're negotiating with peace with Syria, with Saudi Arabia. Okay, just keep it. Just throw the report in the back of the truck. Why do we need to know that? Why? Now Saudi Arabia is reading about this in the news, and now they have to ask these questions. Just let everybody do their job, and then afterwards we'll figure it out. So we're so good about self-reporting, the good and the bad, that we're often our own enemy, right? So, but the point is that also as individuals we should be careful about how much we display success. And so the response is fascinating. Their response as to why they push back on Yehoshua is as follows. They say, no. On the top of page 8, we come from the tribe children of Yosef. Yosef does not have the bad eye. Right? Why? How do we know that? Ben Poras, Yosef Ben Poras, Ale Ayin. Yosef in the blessing of Yaakov was a person who is Ale Ayin, who literally means goes by the well, but actually is interpreted to mean those who ascend above the eye. Those who ascend above the eye, but that's why wherever Yosef went, people viewed him favorably. Wherever Yosef went, he was in the prison. He became an officer in the prison because people loved him. Meaning the point was he had a certain chain. He was above the evil eye. So if we have that DNA, we don't need to go to the forest. And Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan Omar mehacha. You'll never read this paragraph the same after what we're about to learn. This is what it says. Yidgu l'rov b'kerev haaretz. Where does that come from? Hamalach hagoy alosini korah yovorech es ha'ne'arim. Who are the Ne'arim? Ephraim and Menashe, the children of Yosef. V'yidgu l'rov, they'll be like so successful in the land. Ma dagim shevayom. What's yidgu? Like fish. Like we have the Simon and Rosh Hashanah. V'yidgu, they'll be like fish. Why? It says, Mayim mechasim aleim ve'ein ha'ara shalates bohem. You don't see them because they're under the eye. Have you ever been snorkeling or scuba diving? It's that grey blue water on the top. You go underneath a whole world of color, a whole world like it's a forest of life, and it's amazing. It's all under the. You don't see it if you don't have the scuba gear. You're missing the whole picture, right? And that's the point. We can succeed under the eye, right? Under the eye, which is why the Orach HaMakodesh is the most beautiful thing. V'yidgu l'rov b'kerav haaretz. This sounds very evolutionary, right? But here we have the fish, Bekerev Haaretz. Meaning, they're able to take their hiddenness under the sea, but be on the land. And that's the we'll call the dichotomy, the strangeness of Yosef is we can still be successful like fish, but even though we're on the land. Right? Have you ever thought about that? Fish on land? And that's what's being said over here, is they feel that they are protected from this, which is why they feel that they do need more real estate in this case. Yes, Esther?
Is Yosef's tribe the only tribe that expanded, that multiplied?
It sounds like this is the greatest property growth. Yes, that's what it sounds like. There were others like increased, but not to the same ratio. Meaning we're talking about almost doubling, right? Almost 50% in terms of the same age. So the growth was great. I want to close with one last fascinating archaeological point over here. This is really just fascinating. Is here we go, and we'll close with this. It says that they were concerned about the military edge of their enemies because the enemies had what? Iron chariots. I want to ask you, what age are we living in right now? We're in the late bronze, right? So here's the problem, is that the Tanakh keeps talking about these rechev barzel. Barzel is iron. We've not entered the iron age yet, which means they don't have iron. So how could they have a rechev barzel? Rechev, the choshes, is all right? So you could say, and it's anachronism, you could say, no, it's talking later on, maybe going back to the Abarbanel's authorship, which is all one big discussion, that in times of Shmuel, maybe now in the Iron Age, they are projecting strength. But I found a very fascinating article. This is in the Armstrong Institute, which is it's called the Let the Stone Speak. Fascinating. They really have remarkable essays in this. Actually, I just subscribed to their magazine. It's free. It's like they've got amazing stuff going on there in this institute. It's all about Israel and archaeology, and they make the point that it is true that in the Bronze Age they didn't have iron, but they have discovered blades which are embedded with iron even from the Bronze Age. Where did they get the iron from? They had not produced, they had not mined the iron yet. The answer is meteorites. Is that there had been meteorite falls, and you can dig and you can discover at a lower level of ground meteorites which include iron, extraterrestrial iron, and that was what they found. That what they embedded as not as because of its strength, but because of the fact that it's not accessible. So therefore, it's like diamonds. It's like gold, right? They would place that on their weapons. The observation in this article was look at this. In 1925, an iron dagger was discovered in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, who reigned in the 14th century BCE. Iron beads have also been discovered in Egypt, dating back to 3400 to 3100 BCE. In 2016, scientific analysis confirmed that the iron in these objects came from meteoroids. Iron smelting technology, distilling iron from ore and heating it into extreme temperatures, did not exist on a large scale until the Iron Age. Meteoric iron, though rare, is already in its metal state ready to use. This explains why there have been many discoveries of iron products that predate the advent of iron smelting technology. And therefore, Rechev Barzel, argues this article, could refer to the fact that they did have access to this very precious and strong material called iron that they could not produce yet because they weren't in the Iron Age, but they appended it to the chariots of their nobility as you will see that many appended gold to their chariots as a display of power more than a display of this. You can't ride a Rechev Barzel. It's too heavy, right? You can't have an iron chariot. The horses won't be able to pull it. But it is embedded with iron as a display of power. So rather than poo-pooing and saying, oh, Tanakh doesn't know what it's talking about, if we get a little more sophisticated, we can appreciate the complexity of this as well. So from archaeology to authorship to the Gemara's understanding of models, it's all here in one discussion down to Ayin Hara, all in one section. Folks, we're going to continue Bezrat Hashem next week. And I'm very excited.